Welcome to In the Arena. I'm your host, Mindy McAlindon. Today we're going to try something a little bit different. Normally we're talking about trending topics, things that are really important, but today what I think is really important is we're going to talk about America's 250. Next week we're going to celebrate the semi-quincentennial of America's signing of the Declaration of Independence, and I think it's worth talking about. But stay with me because we're not going to talk about the big stories. We're going to talk about some of the smaller things that maybe you haven't heard and might just make you the smartest guy at the barbecue next week. But before we dive into that, what I think we have to talk about is the unbelievable greatness of this country. I don't think we talk about it enough. But since we first protested taxes and poured tea into the sea, America has been on a wild, bold experiment into human liberty like nothing that the world has ever seen. We broke away from a great empire, we declared independence, we built a constitutional republic that was grounded in the consent of the governed and that rights came from God, not from government. That same spirit carried us across the continent. It held the Union together through a brutal civil war. We ended slavery. It fueled inventors who gave us the airplane, the telephone, the light bulb, transistor, even the internet. Inventions that improved life, not just for Americans, but for billions of people around the globe. We stepped up in World War II as an arsenal of democracy. We built a military that outshined every military that ever existed. We helped rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan. We became the first people to put a man on the moon. And it is that same drive that shows up in everyday life. Our free enterprise system built the largest economy in the world, over $32 trillion. GDP per capita is 50% higher than GDP in Europe. And all that turns into real things that we can see and feel. Homes, mobility, choices, and opportunity. And you see it everywhere. We see pickup trucks and wide roads, massive stores, and the freedom to just go wherever you want to go. And right now, with the 2026 World Cup, we're seeing it all over the internet. Visitors from around the world are seeing it up close. They see stacks of pancakes, endless choices at the Walmart shelves, Buc-ee's the size of a small airport, Waffle House at midnight, free refills, air conditioning everywhere. They're seeing America's massive affluence up close, and it blows them away. And that's the kind of life our system delivers for everyday people. It genuinely is surprising people and delighting them. But it's not luck. It comes straight from our founding principles, our drive to innovate, the belief that opportunity should be for anybody willing to work for it. America doesn't just talk about a better life, we actually deliver it day to day in, day out for millions of people. So as we keep moving forward, we have to remember that we are actually one nation under God, incredibly blessed to call America our home. And we have to share that light with the next generation. Okay, so let's get back to talking about how it all started. The road to liberty. We're not going to talk about just the big bangs like the Tea Party and the Declaration, but we're going to talk about some of the hidden sparks of the everyday colonists who refused to bow and stood up for freedom. In 1775, Americans weren't just unified, not even close. Historians estimate that about 40% of Americans supported independence. 15 to 20% were loyalists. They wanted to stay with Britain. And then the largest group, really about 45%, were neutral. They just wanted to live their lives. Every day, nobody bothered them. So this whole thing started with a minority willing to take a risk. Let's talk about a few people that made that happen. And I'm going to start with George Washington, but not the legend George Washington. We're going to talk about young George Washington in his early 20s. He learned a lot of things the hard way. He was in 1754, he was in over his head, fighting in the wilderness in the French and Indian War. And he was forced to surrender at forced necessity under miserable conditions, pouring down rain, defenses failing, everything went wrong. It wasn't great for him. He wasn't a great military leader yet, but it taught him a lot. And then came July of 1755, when British General Braddock was marching toward Fort Duquesne with about 13,000 men, redcoats, tight formations, heavy wagons. It was like a European army on parade. But that's not the way the French and Indian were going to fight. They ambushed the troops from the trees. It was total chaos. British was trying to fight the way they were trained, lining up in formation. In these dense woods, that was a disaster because the Native Americans and the French knew how to handle these woods. They picked off officers one by one. The soldiers began to panic. The entire column began to collapse. And this, right in the middle of it, was a 23-year-old George Washington. Instead of panicking, he got up on horseback, riding back and forth through the gunfire, delivering orders, trying to rally his men, leading the men. not in the leading from behind, but leading from the front. Horses were shot out from under him more than once, but he got up on another horse. Bullets tore through his clothes and through his hat. One account says 4 bullets passed through his clothing, and he wasn't hit once. Washington later would say that he believed that Providence had spared him for a reason. I believe that too. What would America have been without him? General George Braddock was mortally wounded, and Washington organized the retreat, got survivors across the river, and prevented a complete slaughter. The British lost 900 men out of nearly 13,000. It was a devastating defeat. But out of that disaster, Washington learned something very critical. He learned how to fight, but he also earned something very critical. He earned a reputation. Colonists heard about the young officer who stayed calm while other professionals fell. And it was important. It was a lesson that would later matter for him. All right, so let's fast forward to April of 75. This is the first real day of fighting. One of the toughest individuals you've probably never heard of is Samuel Whittemore. He was 78 years old. He was already fought in some of the earlier wars, but on this day, when the British were marching back from Concord, he grabbed a musket, he grabbed 2 pistols and a sword, and he took a position behind a stone wall. And as those British troops were marching back, he stood up and he fired, killed a soldier. He drew his pistols, he'd take down 2 more, and then they rushed him. They shot him in the face, they bayoneted him over a dozen times, they beat him and left him for dead. And when the colonial forces found him, he was still alive, trying to reload his pistols. The doctors didn't think he'd make it, but he lived another 18 years. It is that kind of stubborn, everyday courage that fueled the American Revolution. I think he might have been our first Green Beret. But it wasn't just fighters. We also had people who were willing to gather information. And these were our spies. A young New York tailor named Hercules Mulligan made clothes for British officers. And while he did it, he listened. He gathered intelligence, and he passed it quietly along Washington's network of spies. He played the role of a loyalist so well that some patriots didn't even trust him. But it wasn't just men with secret codes. The ladies were in on it too. They used clotheslines and quilts and all kinds of everyday routines to send signals. And then you had bartenders and tavern keepers and waitresses who were often the quiet ones, just overhearing the gossip and the rumors and the troop movements. And they passed that along at their own risk. This wasn't just spy movies. This was ordinary people taking extraordinary risks. And inside those rooms, it wasn't just famous names. It was people whose names have been lost to history. But we're grateful for what they did. Now, if you step inside Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, this wasn't just a city where a document got signed. It was the place where a brand new nation was being argued into existence, one sentence, one word at a time. The delegates were crowded into the Pennsylvania State House. The air was thick and heavy. There was no air conditioning back then, but they kept the windows shut, not for comfort, but for secrecy, because they knew the British also had spies, and they knew that any word could leak out, and the stakes were enormous. So while they sweated in that room, and outside Philadelphia, you had a bustling colonial city full of printers and tavern workers and political gossip. Inside, men were deciding whether to stay under the British crown or risk everything on independence. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration, but it doesn't come untouched and perfect. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and the rest of the committee argue and debate, and they sharpen it line by line. They cut, they revise, they argue, they compromise. That what makes it so powerful. It wasn't just written, it was forged through pressure. Then comes the signing. This is one of my favorite stories. John Hancock got to sign first. He makes his mark first and big and bold, and the legend says he did it so that King George could read it without his spectacles. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but I think it captures the attitude so perfectly. There's no hesitation, no apology, no turning back. And outside that room, public opinion was being shaped too. The Boston Massacre, what started as a chaotic street fight, and we don't really know exactly how it started, was turned by Paul Revere into one of the most effective pieces of propaganda of the entire revolution. It involved just 5 colonists being killed in the street in 1770, but Revere's engraving made it look like the British were so brutal, and the story spread fast. It helped move public opinion in a huge way. And here's what it really tells you what kind of men these founders were. John Adams, who would go on to write the Constitution, actually defended the British soldiers in court. He believed in justice so much that he was willing to represent the other side, even when it was unpopular. Farmers, lawyers, merchants, these were men who left their homes and their livelihood, debated fiercely, and ultimately signed a document that would cost them everything. And many of them paid the price. Their homes were burned, their businesses were destroyed, properties were seized, they were threatened, some imprisoned, some killed, some forced into exile. When they pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor, it was not symbolic. It was real, and they all knew what that cost was. Years later, at the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin looked at the chair George Washington was sitting in, and there's a sun carved in the back of it. And he said he wondered whether the sun was rising or the sun was setting. But in the end, he knew it was a rising sun because America was going to succeed. And that's the spirit of the founding right there. Men who could see past the danger, see past the doubt, and believe that this new nation was just getting started. But even then, nothing was guaranteed. The war lasted for years. Victory didn't come until 1781. The Constitution wasn't fully in place until 1788. And it would be in 1789 before Washington was actually sworn in as our first president. There's a long way to go on this road that starts with our Declaration. It was a decade of uncertainty. But the story doesn't stop. It keeps going. So as we approach 250 years as a nation, it's worth remembering that this experiment, this wasn't inevitable. It was built by people who may not have been fully united, who didn't have any guarantees, but took the risks anyways. Ordinary people, extraordinary courage. And somehow it worked. And that's where we're living in it today. So the next time you're at a barbecue, you got a few stories to tell that most people won't remember. But most importantly, you know how we got here and the courage and the strength that it took to get us here.